"Give me one verse, and I'll cover your meal," the millionaire taunted, not realizing that his mockery would be the most charity he'd show all year. He had belittled a man in a hoodie, unaware that he was insulting Will Smith. But Keanu Reeves was watching. And when he stood up, everything in that room changed forever. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to subscribe the channel and let us know where in the world are you watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. It was just past 7 p.m. on a warm Friday evening when the doors of La Fontaine swung open. The soft hum of jazz piano floated through the air, mingling with the gentle clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of intimate conversations. The dining room, bathed in the glow of flickering candlelight, felt like an exclusive world where everything was polished and perfect. Designer gowns and $500 steaks were as commonplace as the air itself. But amidst this meticulously crafted image, no one noticed the man who walked in. He didn't look the part. He didn't fit the usual mold. No tailored suit, no Rolex, no polished shoes to make him blend in. Instead, he wore a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers. His eyes, though, seemed sharp, alert, but not in the way the rest of the room was used to. He moved with quiet purpose, not demanding attention, but somehow, that was exactly what drew all eyes to him. His presence didn't announce itself with flashing lights or high-pitched chatter. It was subtle, almost like a shadow slipping through a well-lit room. At first glance, he might have seemed out of place in a venue that thrived on wealth and exclusivity, but as he stood there for a moment, surveying the room, something about him began to feel almost like a challenge. The maitre d' gave him a quick once-over before leading him to an unassuming table at the back. The guests continued their dinners, oblivious to the arrival of someone who would soon command the room's attention in a way no one expected. As the man sat down, his hoodie cast a slight shadow over his face. He wasn't here for the show. He wasn't here to impress anyone. And yet, without saying a word, he was already quietly rewriting the rules of the evening. A moment passed. A subtle tension, barely noticeable, lingered in the air, though no one could quite name it. It was as if the room, while still continuing its usual rhythm, was suddenly aware of something, or someone, who didn't quite belong. The room had barely settled when the doors opened again, but this time, it was not with the subtlety of the first arrival. The doors swung open with a loud creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, deliberate, forceful, with flair, with noise, with arrogance. Leonard Grayson had arrived. His entrance was nothing short of a spectacle. His polished suit gleamed under the soft light, and his expensive cologne seemed to follow him, leaving a trail in the air. His entourage of well-dressed individuals stood behind him, as if his wealth and status were a shield they were all too happy to wear. Leonard moved with an air of someone who had been given permission by the world to take up space. He didn't walk into a room, he dominated it. Without even taking a breath, he plopped down into his chair, immediately ordering a $400 bottle of wine without consulting anyone around him. The maitre d' looked slightly taken aback but swiftly retreated to fetch the bottle. And then, Leonard's voice boomed. "You know what's wrong with art today?" Leonard's voice cut through the murmurs of the room like a chainsaw through butter. It was a monologue so loud that it could have been broadcasted through a microphone. A voice that demanded attention, whether or not anyone asked for it. "No soul," he continued, making a sweeping gesture with one hand. "It's all auto-tuned, overhyped garbage. There's no feeling, no heart, no real emotion left." His words were almost a challenge to the room itself, as if his wealth could buy him a claim on every conversation happening in the space. He paused for a moment, scanning the faces of those around him. Then, with a gleam in his eye, he went further, getting louder and more theatrical by the second. "You know what would be hilarious?" Leonard asked, eyes gleaming with bad intentions. "If one of these modern-day street poets gave us a show, right here, right now." He leaned back in his chair, a grin curling across his lips, as though he was waiting for someone to jump at the chance to fulfill his challenge. Leonard had no intention of truly listening to anyone's response. This wasn't a request, it was a dare, a way of solidifying his dominance in a room where he already felt untouchable. The room was now in full focus. Every head turned. Some people looked on with interest, others with discomfort. But the man in the hoodie, still sitting at the back, remained calm and quiet. His eyes shifted slightly toward Leonard, and though no words were exchanged, the tension between the two had already begun to stir. The air in La Fontaine felt different now. It was charged, electric with the tension of the moment. Leonard Grayson's voice, still brash and unrelenting, sliced through the silence that had followed his previous speech. But this time, his eyes weren't just scanning the room for attention, they were fixed on someone. And in that exact instant, the room shifted. Leonard's gaze landed on Will. He saw the hoodie, the unassuming figure seated at the back, and his lips curled into a smirk. This was it. This was the moment. He had found his next victim. "Hey, you there!" Leonard called across the room, his voice almost mockingly loud as he lifted his glass in Will's direction. "Yeah, you. You wouldn't happen to be a rapper, would you?" For a brief moment, all eyes were on Will. The entire room was watching, waiting for his response. Will, however, didn't look up immediately. He stayed calm, cool, and unreadable, his fingers gently tapping the edge of his glass. His expression was a mask, the kind that hinted at something deeper, but the surface was unshaken. And then, slowly, Will stood. Not because he wanted to. Not because he felt challenged. He stood because of something his grandmother had told him years ago after he was booed during his first high school talent show. Sometimes they don't see you until you make them listen. The memory of those words settled in his chest, like a spark that ignited his very core. It was a reminder of the quiet power he carried within, the kind that needed no stage, no microphone, no approval. Will's gaze fixed on Leonard, unwavering. "I'm not going to take your money," Will said, his voice steady, without a hint of arrogance. "I'm going to take your narrative." The room fell silent once more, and then, in the stillness, Will began to rap. His flow was effortless, his words sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the room. There were no beats, no background music, just his voice. His delivery was raw, steady, powerful. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. With every line, he spoke not only to Leonard but to everyone in the room, exposing their assumptions, their prejudices, their misguided views. Will's rap wasn't just about himself. It was about every voice that had been ignored, every person who had been judged based on where they came from or how they looked. Leonard may have thought he could reduce him to a stereotype, but Will was no one's punching bag. With every word, Will was making them listen. And it was working. The room remained still as Will began to rap. There was no music, no beat, just his voice, raw, steady, and powerful. It was like a quiet storm sweeping through the room, each word landing with precision, each pause drawing the listeners in deeper. Will wasn't performing for entertainment. He was unmasking the biases and stereotypes that people like Leonard had thrown upon him and others like him. As Will rapped, he wasn't just speaking his truth. He was demanding that everyone around him hear it. His words cut through the carefully constructed walls of La Fontaine, slicing through the image of wealth and privilege that had dominated the room. And Leonard's smirk, which had once been a mask of superiority, faded slowly, like a candle losing its flame. The cocky air he had carried into the room melted, replaced by something unfamiliar, something uncertain. The confident words he had spoken just moments before were now nowhere to be found. Will's rap had done more than challenge him, it had exposed him. The final line came softly, yet it felt like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the silence of the room. "I'm not your entertainment. I'm your reminder," Will said, his tone firm, but without anger. It was a quiet declaration, one that resonated with everyone present. Real power never has to ask to be heard. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The room sat in stunned silence. It was as if everyone collectively held their breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the spell. And then, it came. A slow, steady clap. At first, it was just one person, isolated in the corner. But the sound caught on, spreading like wildfire through the room. The applause began as tentative, hesitant clapping, but it soon grew louder, stronger. Heads turned, and eyes widened in recognition of the source of the applause. It was Keanu Reeves. Keanu, whose presence in the room had been largely unnoticed until now, had been quietly watching the performance unfold. His expression was calm, but there was a sense of deep respect in the way he clapped. It wasn't just for the rap. It was for the message behind it. The truth that had been spoken. Keanu's small but deliberate show of support shifted the dynamic once more. The room had just witnessed something transformative, and Keanu's silent nodding, his subtle applause, affirmed that this wasn't just a moment of performance, it was a reckoning. A change in the narrative that could never be undone. Keanu's footsteps were steady, almost deliberate, as he made his way toward Will's table. The air around him felt different now, like the room had shifted in weight, the atmosphere charged with a new kind of gravity. Leonard Grayson, still reeling from Will's rap, was caught off guard once again. His confident facade had begun to crack, and now, Keanu was approaching him like a force of nature. Calm, unshaken, yet undeniable in presence. Keanu didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the heart of the matter. "You came for a show," Keanu said, his voice calm but cutting, as he stood just a few feet from Leonard, "and got a truth you didn't expect." There was a stillness in the room, one that hung like a weight between them. Leonard's eyes narrowed, but Keanu wasn't finished. The clarity in his gaze was unmovable, like he had just struck the final blow in a quiet, inevitable battle. "But what you didn't realize," Keanu continued, his words deliberate, each one falling like a drop of water carving a canyon in Leonard's pride, "is that you challenged a man with more grace in his silence than you've shown in your entire speech." The words lingered in the air, so sharp they almost hummed. It was a quiet rebuke, but Leonard knew it for what it was, an assessment of his soul. The room held its breath. Keanu wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. His words spoke louder than any volume could have. "You thought money bought you power," Keanu went on, taking another step closer. His presence solid, unwavering. "But real power? It walks in quiet. It wears hoodies. It eats alone. And when it speaks, the whole room listens." Leonard opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but Keanu raised a hand, his gesture sharp, commanding, yet devoid of malice. "No. Not tonight," Keanu said, his voice the calm before the storm. "Tonight, you listen." The weight of his words hit like the strike of a gavel, reverberating in the stunned silence. Leonard slowly slumped, his defiance crumbling like a wall under pressure. He sat down, not humiliated by Keanu's words, but disarmed. Reduced. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't anger. It was truth, a reflection held up in front of him, a mirror he couldn't look away from. As Leonard sat down, the room's energy shifted. The whispers that followed were not just of gossip, but of realization. This had gone beyond a mere dinner. It had become a moment, one that would linger in the air long after the meal was over. Keanu's words had shaken something deep, changing the course of the evening in ways no one had anticipated. Will had spoken his truth. Keanu had silenced the storm. But the silence that followed was not one of emptiness. It was a silence that had been earned, a silence that bore weight. Keanu spoke again, his voice low, unshaken. There was no need for theatrics. His words, though soft, cut through the air with surgical precision. He wasn't shouting. His calm tone was enough to carry the weight of his message. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words were already louder than anything Leonard could have said. He turned toward Leonard, locking eyes with him. It wasn't a look of anger, but something sharper, something clearer. "You know what the saddest part is?" Keanu asked, his voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the stillness. His gaze was unflinching, his words careful, measured. "You didn't see him, because you weren't looking. And even now, after everything, you're still not listening." For the first time, Leonard stiffened. He could feel the weight of Keanu's words, and they struck deeper than any insult. The smugness that had once radiated from him began to falter. His posture straightened as the reality of what Keanu was saying began to seep into his consciousness. He wasn't just being challenged by Keanu's words. He was being confronted with the truth. Keanu stepped closer, not with anger, but with clarity. His presence filled the space between them, his very stance commanding attention. "Leonard," his entourage, and even the woman at his side now seemed to regard him with new eyes, as if they were seeing him for the first time. The smugness, the bravado, was slipping away, leaving him exposed. You thought he was a nobody, just a man in a hoodie. You wanted to laugh at him, control him, humiliate him, Keanu continued, each word like a stone cast into the calm waters of Leonard's arrogance. Keanu's eyes flicked briefly to Will, who remained seated, calm, hands resting gently on the table, the very embodiment of unspoken power. But what you didn't realize, Keanu went on, is that you challenged a man with more grace in his silence than you've shown in your entire speech. The room seemed to hold its breath. Leonard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His gaze shifted downward, his arrogance replaced by uncertainty. Keanu had stripped away the layers of his pride, and now Leonard stood exposed. Keanu's final words landed with unshakable force. "You thought money bought you power," he said, his voice steady and firm. "But real power? It walks in quiet. It wears hoodies. It eats alone. And when it speaks, the whole room listens." Leonard opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu raised a hand, halting him mid-sentence. "No, not tonight," Keanu said, his tone firm but calm. "Tonight, you listen." The finality of his words rang in the air like a gavel. Leonard, once the center of attention, now slumped in his seat, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He slowly sank back into his chair, not defeated, but reduced. It wasn't mockery that had undone him, but the weight of the truth, held up before him like a mirror. The room shifted again. There was no grand applause, no cheers, just silence. The kind of silence that follows when the storm has passed, and all that's left is the undeniable impact of truth. Keanu stood up, his words finished. He offered no dramatic gestures, no flourishes, just a nod of quiet respect to Will. He didn't need anything more. The room remained frozen for a brief moment, as if the silence was still processing everything that had just transpired. There was no need for a show. The truth had been spoken, and sometimes that was all that was needed to shift the course of a room. The applause, which had begun with a soft, hesitant murmur, grew slowly. It became stronger, more genuine, as if the room itself was finally waking up from a long slumber. Keanu didn't bask in it. Instead, he turned back to Will and, in a voice so soft only Will could hear, he said, "I owed you that one." His words weren't a concession. They weren't an apology. They were simply acknowledgement, respect given where it was due. Will didn't need to respond with words. His response was a subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of gratitude. It was the kind of moment that didn't require loud proclamations. Some truths only needed to be witnessed. The applause eventually began to fade, but the silence that followed held a certain weight. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence earned by the powerful truth that had just been spoken. It was a silence full of understanding, full of respect. Leonard sat frozen at his table. His wine was untouched, the expensive bottle he'd ordered earlier now irrelevant. His money clip lay forgotten beside his empty plate. His companions, once eager to follow his lead, avoided his gaze. The room had shifted, and Leonard Grayson, once the center of attention, now found himself an outsider. The energy in the room had changed completely. No one was focused on the frivolous details of the evening anymore. The buzz was no longer about luxury, wealth, or status. It was about something far deeper, far more real. The conversations in the room began to resume, but something fundamental had changed. No one was talking about the usual topics: vacations, expensive wines, or their business portfolios. The chatter now centered on the moment that had just unfolded. The room was no longer concerned with surface-level luxury. The conversations had become more introspective, more honest. The atmosphere had shifted from casual indulgence to a deeper reflection. Keanu, sensing the change in the air, stood once again. But this time, there was no performance. His presence was an invitation to something more profound. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "Years ago," Keanu began, his voice steady but quiet, "I went through something I don't talk about much. I lost someone close, and for a long time, I couldn't function, couldn't think, couldn't feel. The room stilled. Some people in the room knew the story, many didn't. But no one spoke. Keanu's words were resonating in a way that wasn't just about his personal pain. It was something everyone could understand. The struggle, the emptiness, the search for something that could break the silence. The only thing that pulled me out of that darkness was music, he continued. Not orchestras, not opera, not jazz. Rap, raw, honest, vulnerable. Like someone yelling into the void, hoping someone out there might understand. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd as people began to recognize the depth of what Keanu was saying. The vulnerability of it. The rawness. Keanu paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. One of those voices was Will's, Keanu said, glancing at Will, who blinked in surprise. Keanu smiled faintly, as if acknowledging something private. I used to sit alone in a tiny apartment in Toronto, playing just the two of us on repeat. Not because it was polished, but because it was real. The room was silent now, listening with reverence, the casual chatter forgotten. Keanu's voice carried the weight of an experience shared, of something much bigger than the moment, much more important. And tonight, Keanu said, gesturing toward Will, you watched a man stand in the middle of a room that tried to shrink him, and instead, he expanded it. Keanu's eyes swept across the room, his words settling heavily. You don't have to like rap. You don't have to wear hoodies. But if your wealth, your title, your table makes you forget how to recognize art when it's beating in front of you, then maybe the problem isn't the culture. Maybe it's the mirror. The room, previously unsure, now responded with tentative applause. It grew louder, stronger. It wasn't just a clap for Keanu, it was a clap for truth, for acknowledgement, for understanding. Keanu simply nodded once, turning to Will and murmured, I owed you that one, before falling silent. And just like that, the room had been transformed. What had started as a night of quiet arrogance, of unchecked privilege, had turned into a moment of reflection, a moment when the truth had been recognized, not with words, but with a quiet, undeniable clarity. Will didn't need words to communicate with Keanu. The understanding between them was mutual, silent, but profound. There was no need for speeches or grand gestures. Their shared recognition of truth and respect spoke louder than anything that could be said. The two men walked side by side toward the door, not because of their fame, but because of the respect they had earned through their actions. As they stepped out of La Fontaine, the crowd parted. The maitre d', who had barely acknowledged Will earlier, now opened the door with a subtle bow, a gesture that held far more weight than any polite smile could offer. Will paused for a brief moment before stepping into the night air, turning just enough to glance back at Leonard. The man who had once commanded the room, now sitting defeated, no longer seemed like a threat. Will's gaze wasn't filled with anger, nor was it laced with pity. It was a look of clarity, a quiet understanding that the real power lay not in loud words, but in the quiet moments that demanded respect. Next time, Will said, his voice steady, don't confuse silence with absence. His words landed without need for follow-up. Leonard, now stripped of his arrogance, had nothing left to say. There was nothing left but silence. Will stepped outside, Keanu close behind, and the doors of La Fontaine closed softly, but the sound felt like a resounding slam to anyone left inside. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the evening's events. Conversations within the restaurant slowly resumed, but nothing was the same. The power of the moment, its silence, its truth, had rewritten everything. Outside, the night was crisp, and the city felt vast and freeing. Will and Keanu walked down the sidewalk in quiet companionship, the sounds of La Fontaine fading behind them. The weight of the evening's events still hung in the air between them, unspoken but felt. Keanu broke the silence first, pulling a small notepad from his coat pocket and handing it to Will. Will took it curiously and saw that Keanu had written a quote on it. Truth doesn't need a stage. It just needs courage. Will smiled, a small, tired smile, but one full of meaning. Thanks, man, he said softly, his voice carrying gratitude and recognition. Keanu returned the smile faintly. Don't thank me. You stood up. I just stood by. They walked together for a bit longer, their paths eventually splitting. There was no farewell, no fanfare, just two men, each carrying an invisible bond that had been forged through the power of truth and respect. By the time morning came, the moment had gone viral. Someone had recorded the entire exchange. The taunts, the rap, the ovation, and Keanu's words that had echoed like calm thunder. Within 12 hours, the video had reached 4 million views. Hashtags trended. Hashtag speak like Will. Hashtag real power. Hashtag I want to stay silent. Think pieces flooded social media. Podcasts dissected every word. Art schools began playing Will's freestyle during weekly reflections. A youth center in Chicago even renamed their open mic night in honor of the moment, calling it the Will Smith Room. Through it all, Will remained silent. No press, no tweets, no grand statements. He returned to his old keyboard, writing not for fame or revenge, but for the kid who once thought his hoodie made him invisible, for the artists who had been told to sit down, for the voices that knew silence not as peace, but as a cage. And, just like that, the world was different. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice to shift a room. And if Will's story inspired anyone, they were now part of something bigger. A movement of truth, silence, and quiet power.